Oregon, 1960. Deep within miles of untouched pine forest lies a small, glass-still lake called Lakewood, a place so quiet, locals used to say that if you stood long enough at its edge, you could hear whispers rising from beneath the water. In early June of that year, 4 teenagers arrived there for a short camping trip, a final taste of freedom before adulthood pulled them apart. But only hours after midnight, something broke the silence of the woods, something violent, something no one could explain. By sunrise, 3 of them were dead, and the only survivor was found crawling near the shoreline, drenched in blood, barely breathing, barely conscious. From that morning on, Lakewood Lake was never just a lake again, and the story of what happened there has haunted Oregon for more than 6 decades. June 4th, 1960. The sun hung low above the ridgeline when Nate Gray guided his old Plymouth down the narrow logging road twisting through the woods. Dust trailed behind the car in a long, shimmering ribbon. Emily Hart sat in the passenger seat, one bare foot tucked under her leg, humming softly to the song leaking from the radio, a faint, crackling melody barely holding on to the station. In the back seat, Dylan Reeves and Sarah Cole were laughing at something no one would even remember hours later. It was laughter that belonged to people who believed nothing bad could ever happen to them. They've been planning this little getaway since early spring, before graduation, before decisions about college and work and the slow gravity of adulthood began pulling at all of them. Lakewood, quiet, familiar, only a few townspeople visited it now, felt like the perfect place to celebrate the last days of being carefree. A night under the stars, one last shared memory before life carried them away in different directions. The clock on the dashboard flickered to 7:03 p.m. when the trees finally opened, revealing the lake. The water stretched out like a sheet of burnished glass, untouched by wind. For a moment, the group fell quiet, staring through the windshield as if the lake itself demanded respect. Something about its stillness looked too perfect, too absolute, like a painting no one should disturb. But then Sarah broke the silence with a cheer, and the spell dissolved. The doors swung open, gear tumbled out, and within minutes the teenagers were alive again with the energy of summer, setting up the tent, unpacking cooler boxes, stringing lanterns, and chasing each other across the shore, their voices bouncing off the water. A fisherman standing at the far end of the lake later recalled that the air that evening felt oddly thick, as if the forest were bracing itself for something unseen. But the teens noticed nothing strange. They built a small fire ring with stones, roasted sausages over the flames, and let the soft orange glow warm their faces as the sky darkened to cobalt. Emily leaned against Nate's shoulder, pointing out stars she didn't really know the names of. Sarah danced barefoot on the sand, while Dylan fiddled with the radio, searching for a station that wasn't swallowed by static. Eventually they settled on a gentle tune, a love ballad, its melody drifting through the trees. Fireflies winked in and out of the darkness, the scent of pine resin and wood smoke mixed with the faint sweetness of Sarah's perfume. It was the kind of night that feels suspended in time, as if the world paused just long enough to let 4 young people exist in a perfect bubble of warmth, laughter, and innocence. Around 10 p.m., Dylan wandered off to gather more firewood. Nate watched Emily trace circles in the dirt with a twig. Sarah braided strands of her hair absent-mindedly. The radio murmured softly. No one noticed how quiet the forest had grown. The crickets had stopped. The wind had died. Even the water looked unnaturally still. Half an hour later, Dylan returned with an armful of branches and a strange expression. When Sarah asked what was wrong, he shrugged it off. "Thought I heard something in the trees," he muttered, "probably just a deer." But he didn't sound sure. They let the fire grow taller, feeding its sticks one by one. Sparks curled upward, disappearing into the dark. It was Nate who suggested taking the rowboat out for a short paddle before calling it a night. Sarah teased him, "Trying to impress Emily again?" and he laughed, swearing that wasn't the reason, but his grin gave him away.
The four of them pushed the little metal boat off the shore, its hull scraping lightly against the sand. The lake was unbelievably calm. Each stroke of the oars sent ripples traveling out across the water in perfect rings. Emily dipped her hand beneath the surface, giggling at the cold. Sarah leaned back, her face turned toward the sky, watching a thin strand of cloud drift past the moon. They didn't speak much. Something about the middle of the lake felt sacred. Dylan mentioned that legend said the lake was deeper than it looked. The divers once tried measuring it, but gave up when the rope kept sinking, never touching bottom. "Maybe it connects to something underground," he joked. "Secret caves, subterranean rivers, or portals to hell." Sarah punched his arm. Emily rolled her eyes. Nate told him to knock it off. But later, when they recalled that moment, or when people tried to piece together what might have happened, that single comment lingered like a seed. By the time they paddled back to shore, the fire had burned low. Dylan tossed the remaining wood onto the embers, and flames licked upward again. The radio buzzed with static, but none of them cared anymore. They were tired, warm from the fire, lulled by the long day. At 11:57 p.m., a man who lived near the trailhead claimed he heard the distant echo of their laughter. Moments later, he heard the music drift off into silence. He thought little of it. Teenagers always played their radios too loud. But what happened next, sometime between midnight and 2 a.m., has never been truly understood. One theory says an intruder approached their camp, moving so quietly he might as well have been part of the fog rolling in from the lake. Another suggests the group might have heard a noise in the trees, stepped outside the tent, and encountered something, or someone, waiting in the dark. Yet another theory claims the killer didn't come from the forest at all, but from the water. What we know for certain is this: the radio went silent. The fire died suddenly, as if smothered. The forest fell into a heavy, unnatural stillness. And by dawn, 3 teenagers would be dead. How it began, no one truly knows. Only Nate, shattered and barely clinging to life, remained, his memories swallowed by the fog. Nate was pulled from the shoreline just after sunrise, drifting in and out of consciousness as rescuers carried him to the boat launch. The medics later said he kept repeating the same broken phrases. "The lights in the trees. Don't let it touch me. They're still out there," before slipping into a state so deep they thought he might never wake again. And while the sheriff's deputies began sealing off the lake, few of them understood the scale of what they had stumbled into. Lakewood had always been isolated, but that morning it felt like the edges of the map had been torn away, leaving only a cold stillness settling over the pines as investigators worked. When they found the first body, a teenage girl sprawled beside the dying campfire with her hands covered in defensive wounds, the deputies assumed it was a brutal but earthly crime. A killer on the loose, perhaps someone the group had met on the road. But the second body, discovered several yards away near the tree line, changed the tone instantly. His ribs were crushed inward with a force none of them could explain, as if something had slammed into him at high speed, something strong enough to fold bone like thin metal. And when they finally located the third victim, floating, face down near the reeds on the far side of the lake, the scene grew even more impossible. Her clothing was torn in irregular, uneven strips, almost as if they had been cut not by a blade, but by something jagged and moving, something unlike any animal known to those woods. For the next several hours, officers combed through the pine forest in widening circles, searching for tracks, drag marks, footprints, anything that could point to a human attacker. But the ground offered nothing. No boot prints, no tire marks, no sign of a struggle beyond the chaotic destruction within the campsite itself. It was as though whatever had torn through the 4 teenagers had slipped back into the darkness without disturbing the earth at all. Later that afternoon, while the bodies were being transported to the county coroner, the sheriff stood on the lakeshore staring out at the flat, motionless water. The breeze was calm, the forest quiet, and to anyone passing through, Lakewood looked like a place where nothing violent had ever happened. But the sheriff kept glancing toward a small patch of plants near the shoreline, the only place where something resembling a track existed, though he couldn't decide if it looked more like a footprint or the imprint of a heavy, uneven object pressed into the soil. Before he could examine it further, one of his deputies called him to the hospital. Nate, they said, had woken up, and he was trying to speak. When the sheriff arrived at the hospital, the corridors were quiet in the way rural hospitals always seem to be, fluorescent lights humming faintly above polished linoleum floors, nurses speaking in soft clipped tones, the smell of antiseptic clinging to the air. Room 204 sat at the far end of the hall, guarded by a single deputy, who stood rigid, as if afraid that whatever had torn through the woods might somehow follow Nate here. Inside, Nate lay propped against a pillow, his face pale and bruised, his arms wrapped in bandages. What unsettled the sheriff wasn't Nate's injuries, though they were extensive. It was Nate's eyes. They didn't look like the eyes of a teenager who had survived a traumatic night. They looked older, hollowed out, as if something inside him had been scraped away, leaving only the echo of what used to be fear. The doctor warned the sheriff that Nate's memory could be fragmented, but the moment the sheriff stepped to the bedside, Nate's breathing quickened. He stared past the sheriff toward the far window, as though watching something move in the tree line beyond the glass. Then, in a shaking whisper, he began.
Still, how the lake looked black and bottomless once the moon vanished behind the clouds. But then his voice changed, lower, strained, and he described a sound he insisted was the first sign that the night would not end normally. It wasn't an animal cry, he said. It wasn't the crack of a branch or the groan of shifting wind. It was more like a vibration, a deep, trembling hum that seemed to come not from the forest, but from inside the lake itself. The others heard it too, though no one could agree on what it resembled. Some thought it was distant machinery. One thought it was the echo of a boat engine. But Nate said it felt like something was calling, like something beneath the water was rising, pushing up through the dark. The sheriff pressed him to clarify, but Nate shook his head, gripping the sheets with trembling fingers. He said the humming grew louder, not around them, but through them, as if the sound were passing inside their bones. And then came the lights. Not bright, not like lanterns or flashlights, more like faint strands of pale blue drifting between the trees, moving with an unnerving slowness, as though whatever produced them was studying the group from a distance. The sheriff asked if it could have been other campers, maybe kids playing a prank, but Nate's reaction was immediate and desperate. No, not people. Not anything he recognized. The lights didn't bob or sway the way handheld ones do. They glided. Soft, silent, effortless, and each time they drifted closer, the humming in the ground intensified until the 4 teenagers could feel it pulsing in their teeth. Nate's voice cracked when he described the moment the humming stopped, suddenly, completely, leaving a silence so sharp it felt like pressure against the skull. And in that silence, he said, something stepped out from the tree line. He couldn't describe it, not clearly. Every time he tried, his breaths became short, his eyes darting as though watching the memory unfold again, right there in the hospital room. He spoke only in fragments. Enormous, wrong shape, moving too fast, too quiet, too smooth. Not an animal, not a person, not anything that belonged to Lakewood or to Oregon or to the world he knew. The sheriff leaned closer, trying to piece together the broken edges of Nate's story. But Nate had begun shaking, gripping the rails of the bed. He said the thing didn't attack them at first. It stood there, half shadow, half light, as if uncertain of its own form. And then one of the teens screamed. A single scream, sharp enough to split the silence, and that was when the thing moved. Nate's voice dissolved, his words thinning into a trembling whisper as he stared at the floor, unable to continue. The sheriff waited, letting the room settle, letting Nate breathe. But deep down, he knew this wasn't the whole story, not even close. And as Nate fell back against the pillow, exhausted and trembling, the sheriff realized something with growing dread. The boy wasn't just afraid of what he had seen in the forest. He was afraid it might still be out there, moving through the trees, watching, waiting for something or someone to return.
Halverson straightened, letting the cold breath of the forest pass over him, then turned back to the things he trusted more than instinct or dread. Evidence, testimony, the behaviors of real people, the kind that could be logged, measured, and eventually cornered. At the center of the clearing, the forensics team was finishing their final sweep. Camera flashes strobed every few seconds, catching on the thin veil of morning mist like tiny slashes of light cutting through the quiet. A technician knelt by the fire pit, lifting charred fragments with a pair of tweezers. Pine wood, scraps of burned paper, half a melted blister pack of pills. Nothing unusual on the surface, but the detail that tugged at Halverson's attention sat near the edge of the campsite. 2 empty beer bottles, positioned several yards apart, even though the teenagers hadn't brought any alcohol. And nearby, a set of shoe prints, broad, unfamiliar, much larger than any worn by the 4 victims. The trail stretched about 40 yards before ending abruptly in a stretch of soft pine needles. No pivot, no drag, no shift in weight, as if the person simply stopped, deliberately. Near a makeshift wooden table, Deputy Ramirez was taking statements from an older couple who had been hiking at dawn. They'd heard something the night before, not screaming, but the brief rumbling ignition of a truck engine, followed by silence. The husband claimed he saw a beam sweep through the trees around 1 in the morning, like a spotlight mounted high, not car headlights. The wife added that she'd smelled burnt rubber, but assumed some kids were fooling around. Halverson listened from several paces away, the tension collecting in his shoulders. If someone else had been out here during the night, the bottles, the prints, they weren't stray details. They were clues pointing towards someone who had walked into the dark with purpose. Down by the gravel turnout, officers were combing through the group's pickup truck. The back was untouched, fishing gear, camping tools, a bag of unused charcoal. No sign of a struggle, no panic. But on the driver's side door, a clean fingerprint turned up, one that didn't match any of the 4 victims. One of the younger officers dusting the panel murmured, "There's no indication they ran from anything. Whoever came up on them did it before they even realized something was wrong." Halverson walked toward Deputy Collins, who was reviewing a list of individuals flagged in the area over the past month. One name stood out in the cluster: Arthur Nix, a hunter living alone in a cabin 7 miles from Lakewood, known for clashing with loud campers. No record of violence, but a short fuse. Another name surfaced: Evan Mercer,
arrested 2 years prior for voyeuristic behavior in the woods, now drifting through campsites around the southern ridge. "We talked to Nix first," Halverson said, voice low but firm. "And I want every trail map for this section of the forest. If someone else was out here last night, they didn't just vanish into thin air." A breeze rolled through the pines, rustling the branches in a long, cool sigh. But this time, the forest didn't feel haunted. It felt methodical, watchful, a place that had held the truth long before the bodies were taken away and was waiting for someone patient enough to uncover it. The investigation into Arthur Nix stretched for 3 days, each hour peeling away more of the forest's silence. Halverson pushed hard: shoe prints, the dented flashlight, the late-night truck engine the hikers heard, but none of it stuck. Nix's truck was found exactly where he claimed it would be, axle half disassembled, the metal cold in a way that suggested it hadn't moved in days. The boots matched the pattern at the campsite, yes, but so did half the hunting boots sold in Douglas County that year. His alibi wasn't solid, but it wasn't breakable either. He had no motive, and in the end, no evidence placed him at the lake at the time of the murders. By the end of the week, Nix was dropped quietly from the list, the suspicion around him dissolving into nothing more than the smoke rising from his cabin's chimney. Attention turned next to Evan Mercer. Mercer's past made him an easy target: wandering the woods, unsteady employment, the voyeurism charge that neighbors never forgot. But when Halverson interviewed him, something unexpected happened. Mercer cried. Not guilty tears, not strategic ones, but the trembling collapse of a man genuinely terrified of being dragged into something monstrous. The man's sister confirmed he'd been at her home the entire night, fixing a broken kitchen cabinet. The police found the cabinet, the tools, the receipts. He couldn't have been near Lakewood. Once again, suspicion evaporated. One by one, more names were considered. Drifters, hunters, a pair of teenagers known for sneaking around campsites. All of them either had alibis or no connection at all. Every path circled back to the same point. The only person left at the lake that night was Nathan Gray, the survivor.
Halverson resisted the thought at first, violently resisted it. Nate's injuries made him look like a victim, not a killer. A shattered jaw, deep scalp wounds, blood loss so severe doctors called it a miracle he'd crawled far enough to be found. And yet, some details didn't fit. The survivors of violent attacks often remembered fragments, flashes. Nate remembered almost nothing. Not the fight, not the screams, not the killer's face, nothing except a vague memory of the rowboat and the firelight. And as days passed, the absence of memory became its own presence, too heavy, too neat, too convenient. Halverson never said it out loud, but the suspicion lodged in his ribs like a splinter. If the killer wasn't Nix, wasn't Mercer, and didn't come from outside the camp, then who else had been there? Who else had access to the tent, the gear, the victims? Who else had blood on the inside of the tent that didn't match any of the 3 murdered kids? The fog of that night had swallowed everything except this single, growing question. 44 years later, time did what it always does. It waited. It let science evolve. It let boxes of old evidence gather dust until someone asked the right question at the right moment. In 2004, Oregon State Police launched a statewide initiative to re-examine cold cases using new DNA technology. Lakewood, unsolved, infamous, and still whispered about, was among the first selected. Technicians opened the sealed evidence envelopes like archaeologists studying an ancient tragedy. They extracted dried blood scrapings from the tent walls, preserved soil samples, a few dark stains from a torn jacket. And when the results came back, the state lab supervisor called Salem's district attorney personally. The DNA found near the entrance of the tent, blood in a spot where only the attacker could logically be standing, matched Nathan Gray. The news spread like wildfire. Reporters descended on the case with the hunger of a nation that had forgotten the story, but never the ghost of it. Talk shows debated motives, documentaries resurfaced, and within days, newspapers began printing the phrase that would follow Nate forever: the survivor killer. August 2005, Salem, Oregon. The Lakewood trial began with more press than seats, journalists spilling into the hallways, taking notes as if history were being written one breath at a time. The prosecution laid out their theory: jealousy, anger, opportunity, the DNA, the argument by the fire, a moment of rage spiraling into bloodshed. The defense countered with every limitation in the case: contaminated evidence, sloppy 1960s crime scene handling, missing logs, contradictory witness memories. They reenacted the injuries Nate sustained, showing the jury how unlikely it would be for him to overpower even one person in that condition. Both sides made sense. Both sides collapsed eventually under the weight of what they couldn't prove. 8 weeks passed. The jury deliberated for 2 days. Nathan Gray was found not guilty due to insufficient evidence. He walked out of the courthouse without a word and without looking back. But Oregon didn't forgive, and it never forgot. To the public, only 2 possibilities remained. Either Nate was the victim of a perfect killer, or he was that killer. In the end, nothing pointed anywhere. No evidence strong enough to accuse, no witness reliable enough to trust, no theory solid enough to hold. Every lead collapsed into dust. Every answer opened another question. And so the case remained where it always had been, frozen in uncertainty. To this day, the Lakewood murder file sits untouched in the Oregon archives. A story without a culprit, a night without clarity, a silence no investigator has ever managed to break. And the tragedy by Lakewood remains one of the most unsettling, most baffling unsolved cases in Oregon's history. A mystery suspended in time, with no justice, no resolution, and no truth anyone can prove.
Thanks for watching. I hope to see you again in the upcoming videos. Please subscribe to the channel and follow the exciting videos coming soon.